I chose the safe life. Not because I loved it. Not because it inspired me. But because it promised I wouldn't lose too much. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided admitting to myself for years: I didn't fail at life. I minimized it. From the very beginning, I learned to look at the world like a list of risks. Every choice carried a potential loss, and my instinct was always the same: reduce exposure. Avoid extremes. Don't gamble with things you can't afford to lose. That mindset followed me everywhere. When I stood at crossroads, I didn't ask what would fulfill me. I asked what would hurt less if it went wrong. When opportunities appeared, I didn't feel excitement, I felt calculation. I learned to measure outcomes instead of listening to impulses. People called me sensible. I accepted the compliment without realizing it was slowly turning into a sentence. I watched others take chances that terrified me. They changed careers, moved cities, chose love that wasn't guaranteed, followed instincts they couldn't fully explain. Some of them failed. Some of them struggled. But all of them seemed alive in a way I couldn't quite access. I told myself they were reckless. I told myself I was smart. The safe life rewarded me quickly. Stability arrived early. Predictability followed. I avoided the chaos that swallowed other people. My days were structured. My future looked manageable. From the outside, everything worked. From the inside, something felt unfinished. I didn't hate my life. That was the problem. There was no obvious misery to justify dissatisfaction. Nothing was wrong enough to walk away from. Everything was just good enough to stay. So I stayed. I stayed in jobs that didn't challenge me because they paid reliably. I stayed in relationships that felt comfortable but shallow because they didn't threaten me. I stayed in routines that numbed me because they didn't demand courage. Each time I chose safety, I felt relief. Each time, I also felt a quiet disappointment I couldn't explain. Over time, that disappointment accumulated into something heavier. Not sadness. Not anger. A dull pressure, like a question I refused to answer pressing against my chest. Is this all I'm willing to risk my life for? I didn't say that question out loud. I didn't even fully think it. I learned how to suppress it with logic. Gratitude. Comparison. I reminded myself how lucky I was. How many people would trade places with me. That argument worked, for a while. But safety has a cost people don't talk about. It shrinks your world. I noticed how careful my dreams had become. How my ambitions fit neatly into what I already knew how to do. I stopped imagining futures that required transformation. Everything I wanted existed within the boundaries of who I already was. That should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like living in a room with the door locked from the inside. I started to feel tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Conversations felt repetitive. Achievements felt hollow the moment they arrived. I reached milestones and felt nothing except the urge to protect what I had. The more I had to lose, the safer I became. And the safer I became, the less I was willing to live. I didn't realize yet that safety isn't neutral. It slowly rewrites your priorities. It teaches you to value preservation over growth. Comfort over curiosity. Control over possibility. And one day, without warning, you wake up and realize your life has become a series of avoided losses instead of chosen experiences. I was approaching that realization. I just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost me. The moment safety stopped feeling like protection, it didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine. I began to notice how often my days repeated themselves. Not exactly, but emotionally. The same tone. The same level of engagement. The same muted reactions. Nothing startled me anymore. Nothing truly disappointed me either. I had optimized my life into emotional neutrality. At first, I told myself this was peace. That calm was the reward for making careful choices. But peace has a softness to it, a sense of rest. What I felt wasn't rest. It was stagnation. I realized that safety had slowly become a filter through which I experienced everything. Before acting, I asked how much I could lose. Before speaking, I calculated the consequences. Before wanting something, I evaluated whether wanting it was worth the risk. Desire had to justify itself. Most of the time, it didn't pass the test. I watched my world shrink without collapsing. And that was the most dangerous part. Nothing broke loudly enough to force change. I was functioning too well to justify disruption. But inside, something was tightening. I began to feel a strange envy toward people who were struggling. Not because I wanted their pain, but because they seemed to be in motion. Their lives had direction, even when it hurt. Mine felt preserved, sealed, untouched. I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of exposure. Failure implies you tried. Exposure implies you wanted something enough to risk being seen. Safety allowed me to avoid both. I told myself I was being responsible. That risk was overrated. That stability mattered more than intensity. Those statements sounded wise, until I realized how often I used them to silence a deeper dissatisfaction. I had stopped asking myself difficult questions because difficult questions threatened the structure I relied on. What would I do if I weren't afraid of losing what I have? Who would I become if I stopped protecting myself so carefully? Those questions didn't feel inspiring. They felt dangerous. I started to understand something uncomfortable. The safe life doesn't trap you suddenly. It seduces you slowly. It rewards caution early, so you don't notice how much it demands later. Each year, I had more to protect. More habits. More explanations. More reasons not to change. Safety compounded itself, until it felt irresponsible to disrupt it. And then came the realization that hurt more than any failure could have. I wasn't choosing safety anymore. Safety was choosing for me. My decisions had become predictable even to myself. I knew how I would respond before situations arose. My life no longer surprised me, and that included my own reactions. I had become reliable at the cost of being alive. The fear of loss had kept me from losing anything important, except time. I began to see how many moments I had declined not because they were wrong, but because they were uncertain. How many paths I had avoided simply because they required becoming someone new. Change had always felt optional. Now it felt overdue. I experienced a growing sense of lateness. Not chronological, existential. A feeling that something essential had been postponed for too long, and that postponement itself had become the real risk. Safety had stopped feeling like wisdom. It felt like fear wearing a suit. And once I saw that, I couldn't go back to believing the story I had told myself for years. The story where I was cautious, rational, ahead of the curve. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I had chosen safety because it asked nothing of me except endurance. And endurance, without direction, turns into quiet regret. I could feel myself approaching a threshold, a point where staying safe would no longer be neutral. Where not choosing differently would itself become a decision with consequences. I didn't know yet whether I had the courage to cross that line. I only knew that if I didn't, this would be my life forever, intact, respectable, and unbearably small. The moment I finally understood what the safe life had taken from me, it wasn't loud. It didn't come with panic or desperation. It came with clarity. I was sitting in the middle of an ordinary day, doing something familiar, when a thought surfaced without emotion or drama: if nothing changes, this is how my life will end. Not tragically. Not painfully. Just, quietly. That thought settled into me with a weight I couldn't shake. I realized that safety had not ruined my life, it had simply ensured that nothing remarkable would ever happen in it. No deep failures. No defining risks. No moments that demanded everything from me. I had avoided catastrophe. I had also avoided transformation. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the end of my life honestly. Not as a crisis, but as a conclusion. I saw myself looking back and realizing that I had protected my existence instead of inhabiting it. That I had kept everything intact by never fully stepping into it. That image frightened me more than any risk ever had. Because it wasn't about losing what I had. It was about never discovering what I could have been. I didn't suddenly become brave. I didn't quit everything or reinvent myself overnight. The safe life had shaped me too deeply for that. What changed was simpler, and harder. I stopped letting safety be the deciding factor. I began choosing things that didn't guarantee comfort. I said yes when I couldn't predict the outcome. I allowed myself to want things that didn't fit neatly into my existing life. I made decisions that couldn't be fully justified in advance. Each choice came with fear. But it was a different kind of fear. Not the fear of loss, the fear of exposure. And that fear told me I was finally touching something real. Some choices didn't work out. Some risks didn't reward me. I felt disappointment more sharply than I ever had before. I felt uncertainty in ways I had spent years avoiding. But alongside that discomfort came something unexpected. Depth. Moments began to matter again. Days stopped blending together. I felt frustration, excitement, regret, hope, not in moderation, but fully. My life stopped feeling optimized and started feeling personal. I learned something crucial during that transition. Safety doesn't give you peace. It gives you permission to avoid living. Peace comes from alignment, from choosing a life that costs you something because it gives you something back. I don't reject safety now. I just refuse to worship it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, someone who has chosen the safe path over and over again, I'm not telling you to gamble everything you have. I'm telling you to notice what safety has quietly taken from you. Ask yourself whether the life you're protecting is one you would choose again if you were truly honest. Ask yourself what you've never done because it didn't feel safe enough. I chose the safe life. And for a long time, I told myself that meant I was smart. What I didn't realize was that safety was slowly teaching me how to disappear without anyone noticing, including myself. I don't know how my life will turn out now. But I know this. I would rather risk losing parts of my life than reach the end having never truly lived it. I played it safe. And the regret wasn't immediate. It arrived quietly, and stayed. Choosing differently didn't erase that regret. But it finally gave it meaning. And that, finally, feels like living.